In the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, a pregnant widow named Nora Talbot works her father's forge, crafting horseshoes and wagon wheels for the local ranchers. Her hands are steady, her heart guarded, and her belly growing with new life. When she meets Eli Granger, a once feared gunslinger, now confined to his cabin after a bushwhacking left him paralyzed, the whole town whispers about the broken man who won't accept help from anyone. But Nora sees something different. Working in secret for weeks, she forges something the frontier has never seen: a custom wheelchair built from iron and oak, cushioned with worn saddle leather. The day she rolls it into his cabin, Eli weeps for the first time since the shooting. What happens next transforms not just two wounded souls, but an entire community. But will Eli's past catch up with them before their future can begin?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge, painting the settlement in shades of amber and gold that reminded Nora Talbot of better times. She stood at the entrance of her father's blacksmith shop, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other gripping the worn leather apron that had once belonged to Samuel Talbot, a man whose steady hands had shaped horseshoes and dreams with equal precision. The settlement stretched before her like a patchwork quilt of weathered wood and hope. Established in 1878, when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad pushed through the valley, Cedar Ridge had grown from a handful of tents to a respectable community of 200 souls. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, their peaks still crowned with snow, even in late September, promising a hard winter ahead. Nora's forge occupied the corner of Main Street and Pioneer Avenue, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light and the attention of passing riders. The building itself was modest rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw, a stone chimney that Samuel had built with his own hands, and a sign that read, S. Talbot, blacksmith, in fading letters that Nora couldn't bring herself to change. Inside, the familiar weight of hammer and anvil waited. The bellows hung silent, but she could almost hear her father's patient voice explaining the mysteries of heated metal, how iron became malleable under fire, how strength came not from hardness alone, but from knowing when to bend. These lessons had taken on new meaning since Thomas died in the copper mine collapse 6 months ago, leaving her with child and the forge as her only means of survival. The baby stirred within her, a gentle flutter that made her smile despite the weight of morning sickness that still plagued her. Dr. Henderson estimated she was nearly 6 months along, though the loose-fitting dresses made it difficult for casual observers to tell. The women of Cedar Ridge had rallied around her after Thomas's death, bringing casseroles and unsolicited advice in equal measure. But Nora preferred the honest company of heated metal to the complicated sympathy of well-meaning neighbors. Martha Kingsley emerged from the general store across the street, her generous frame wrapped in a calico dress and her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun that softened whenever she smiled. At 53, Martha had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children, earning her the unofficial title of town mother and chief source of news, gossip, and occasionally wisdom. "Morning, Nora dear," Martha called, shaking dust from a braided rug. "How are you feeling today?" "Strong enough to work," Nora replied, lighting the forge with practiced movements. The kindling caught quickly, fed by the constant breeze that swept down from the peaks. "Mrs. Henderson wants her kitchen knives sharpened, and Jim Morrison needs new shoes for his moray." Martha's expression grew thoughtful, the way it did when she was working up to saying something important. "Speaking of work, you might want to know that Eli Granger's been coming into town more regular lately. Yesterday, he managed to get himself as far as the hitching post outside my store before." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Before he had some difficulty." Nora had heard whispers about Eli Granger since arriving in Cedar Ridge 3 years ago as Thomas's bride. The stories varied depending on the teller, but certain facts remained consistent. He had been a gunfighter of considerable reputation, known throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories as the Granger Ghost, for his ability to appear and disappear like morning mist. Some said he had killed 12 men in fair fights. Others claimed the number was higher, and the fights weren't always fair. What everyone agreed on was that Eli Granger had been faster than lightning, quicker than thought, deadly as winter, until the day he wasn't fast enough. The ambush had happened 4 years ago, somewhere in the Badlands between Cedar Ridge and Durango. Jake Murdoch and his gang had caught Eli in a canyon with no way out, filling him with lead and leaving him for dead. But Eli Granger had proven as hard to kill as he was to catch. He'd crawled 2 miles to a water source and been found 3 days later by a traveling preacher, more dead than alive, but still breathing. The bullets had shattered his spine, stealing the use of his legs and condemning him to a half-life that seemed crueler than a clean death. Now he lived in a cabin 2 miles outside town, surviving on Army disability payments and the rare generosity of neighbors who left supplies on his porch when they knew he wouldn't see them do it. Pride, Dr. Henderson explained, was sometimes the only thing keeping a broken man breathing. And Eli Granger had pride enough for 10 men. What kind of difficulty? Nora asked, adjusting the bellows to bring the coals to proper heat. The kind that comes from trying to reach supplies loaded too high on a pack horse when you can't stand up to get them, Martha said gently. Poor man spent near 20 minutes wrestling with a bag of flour before Jim Morrison's boy offered to help. The look Eli gave that child could have curdled milk. Nora had seen Eli exactly 3 times in the past year. The first was at Thomas's funeral, where he'd sat in the back pew of Father Miguel's chapel, his wheelchair positioned near the door, as if ready for quick escape. He'd worn his best clothes, a black suit that hung loose on his diminished frame, a white shirt gone yellow with age, and a string tie that had seen better days. His face had been carved from weathered leather, all sharp angles and deep lines, with eyes the color of winter sky. He'd left during the final hymn, rolling himself out so quietly that most folks didn't notice his departure. The second time was at the general store, where she'd glimpsed him through the window as she passed. He'd been counting coins with the methodical precision of a man who knew exactly how little he had, his fingers moving over copper pennies and silver dimes like a miser with his treasure. When he'd looked up and caught her watching, she'd seen something flicker in those pale eyes, not anger, exactly, but a wariness so deep it made her chest ache. The third time had been 2 weeks ago, when she'd encountered him on the road leading to his cabin. His horse had thrown a shoe, and he'd been examining the hoof with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that small problems could become large ones quickly when you lived alone and couldn't walk. She'd stopped to offer help. She always carried basic shoeing supplies in her wagon, but he'd declined with the sort of politeness that was actually rudeness, thanking her in a tone that suggested she should keep moving. But she'd noticed things during that brief encounter. The way his hands, scarred from years of fast draws and hard living, moved with surprising gentleness over the horse's leg. The careful way he transferred from horseback to his wheelchair, a clumsy wooden contraption that looked like it had been assembled by someone with more good intentions than carpentry skills. Most of all, she'd noticed the hollowness in his eyes, the look of a man who was breathing but not really living. Perhaps, Martha continued, lowering her voice though they were alone on the street, someone with your particular skills might consider paying him a visit, not to offer charity. Mind you, we all know how he feels about that, but maybe to discuss business matters. Nora looked up from the forge, where the coals were beginning to glow with proper heat. What sort of business matters? The sort that come from being the best metal worker between here and Denver, with a talent for solving problems other folks can't even see. Martha's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. That wheelchair of his is held, together with hope and baling wire. A woman who can craft a wagon axle strong enough to cross the Continental Divide might have thoughts on how to build something more substantial. The idea took root in Nora's mind like a seed finding good soil. She'd been thinking about mobility since her pregnancy advanced, how difficult it was becoming to move around the forge, how her changing body required different approaches to familiar tasks. But Eli's challenges were permanent, and his current solution was clearly inadequate. Father Miguel appeared at the corner of Main and Pioneer, his brown Franciscan robes fluttering in the morning breeze. At 42, Miguel Santos had been serving the spiritual needs of Cedar Ridge for 8 years, arriving from Santa Fe with nothing but a worn Bible, a traveling altar, and an unshakable faith in human decency. His chapel was small, but always open, his sermons brief but pointed, and his door available to anyone who needed counsel, confession, or simply a sympathetic ear. Good morning. Ladies, he said, touching the brim of his hat with fingers stained from copying scripture by candlelight. I trust this fine day finds you well? Well enough, Martha replied. We were just discussing ... community needs. Father Miguel's dark eyes, intelligent and kind, moved between the two women with the perception of a man who'd spent years listening to what people didn't say. Ah, the sort of community needs that require careful thought and Christian compassion? The sort that require practical skills and maybe a little divine inspiration, Nora said, surprising herself with the admission. Those are often the same thing, Father Miguel replied. I've found that God's voice is clearest when we're working with our hands, creating something useful from raw materials. There's prayer in honest labor, and grace in helping others bear their burdens. Dr. Henderson's familiar figure rounded the corner from Medical Street, his black bag swinging in rhythm with his brisk pace. At 58, Jonas Henderson had been caring for Cedar Ridge's medical needs since the town's founding, treating everything from childbirths to gunshot wounds with equal competence. His white hair was always perfectly combed, his shirts always clean despite the nature of his work, and his manner always professional but warm. Morning, Nora, he said, stopping to rest his bag on the hitching post. How are you feeling? Any more dizzy spells? None for 3 days, she replied. And the nausea is finally starting to ease. Good. You're entering the easier months now. Enjoy them while they last. His eyes grew serious. Are you still planning to work right up until the birth? I have to. The forge doesn't run itself, and I can't afford to hire help. Dr. Henderson nodded, understanding the economics of frontier life too well to argue. Just remember what we discussed about lifting heavy pieces. Your back is already adjusting to carry the baby. Don't ask it to carry anvils as well. Actually, Martha interjected, we were just discussing the possibility of Nora taking on some specialized work. The kind that requires more brain than brawn. Dr. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. Oh? Mobility solutions, Nora said, the words forming themselves as she spoke. For people with particular needs. Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. Yes, I can see how that might be both challenging and rewarding work. There's certainly a need for better solutions than what's currently available. They were. All thinking of Eli now, though none of them said his name. In a community as small as Cedar Ridge, privacy was both precious and impossible. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but good neighbors pretended not to when discretion was required. Well, Father Miguel said after a moment of comfortable silence, I should be getting back to my morning prayers. But Nora, if you decide to pursue this specialized work, remember that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones given without being asked for. There's a parable about that, if you're interested. I know the one, Nora replied. The widow's mite. Actually, I was thinking of the Good Samaritan. Sometimes healing comes from unexpected sources, and sometimes the person who needs healing most is the one doing the helping. After the others had gone about their morning business, Nora stood alone at her forge, watching the coals shift from red to orange to white-hot intensity. She'd learned to read fire the way sailors read weather, understanding its moods, predicting its behavior, knowing when to feed it and when to let it burn. Steady ideas began forming in her mind like metal, taking shape under the hammer. Wheels, certainly, but what kind? Wagon wheels were too large, cart wheels too flimsy. Something new would be required, something designed specifically for a man's weight and the rough terrain around Cedar Ridge. The frame would need to be strong but light, allowing for maneuverability without sacrificing durability. And comfort that was crucial. Eli's current wheelchair looked like an implement of torture, all hard wood and sharp edges. A man who'd already suffered enough deserved better than that. The baby moved again, stronger this time, as if responding to her mother's Excitement. Nora placed both hands on her belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing within her. This child would be born into a world where people helped each other not because they had to, but because they chose to. That was a legacy worth building. One careful decision at a time. She picked up her father's journal, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Samuel Talbot had recorded everything in this book: designs for wagon repairs, notes about different steel grades, sketches of particularly challenging projects. Somewhere in these pages, combined with her own growing knowledge, lay the solution to Eli Granger's problem. Whether he wanted that solution or not remained to be seen. But as Father Miguel had suggested, sometimes the greatest gifts were the ones given without being asked for. And sometimes, Nora thought, as she began her first rough sketches, the giver received more than the recipient ever could. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the forge and filling the shop with golden light. Outside, Cedar Ridge continued its daily rhythm of survival and hope, unaware that in one small corner of their community, a pregnant widow was beginning to dream of wheels that could carry a broken man back to the world of the living. 3 days after her conversation with Martha, Nora found herself face to face with the reality of Eli Granger's struggles in a way that would change everything. She'd been returning from the Morrison Ranch, where she'd delivered a set of horseshoes and collected payment in the form of fresh eggs and a small bag of flour, the kind of bartering that kept frontier communities alive. Her wagon rolled easily along the dirt road that connected the outlying homesteads to Cedar Ridge proper, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. The road curved around a stand of aspen, trees whose leaves had turned the color of newly minted gold coins, and as Nora guided her mare around the bend, she saw him. Eli Granger sat motionless beside his horse, about 20 yards ahead, his wheelchair positioned at an awkward angle that suggested trouble. Her first instinct was to turn around, to respect his obvious desire for privacy and independence. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that Eli preferred to handle his difficulties alone, and approaching him uninvited was likely to earn her nothing but harsh words and wounded pride, his and possibly hers. But as she drew closer, the nature of his predicament became clear. His horse, a patient bay gelding named Buck, according to local gossip, stood perfectly still while Eli struggled to reach a canvas supply bed that had somehow worked its way to the animal's far side. The wheelchair's wooden wheels had sunk slightly into the soft earth beside the road, and each time Eli leaned forward to grab the bag's rope handle, the chair threatened to tip, forcing him to grab the wheel rims to steady himself. What might have been a simple 30-second task for an able-bodied person had become a complex engineering problem for a man whose legs could no longer provide the stability and leverage that most people took for granted. Nora could see the frustration in the rigid line of his shoulders, the careful control in his movements that spoke of a man who'd learned to mask his limitations. Behind precise planning and stubborn determination, she pulled her wagon to a stop and called out, "Afternoon, Mr. Granger." He looked up sharply, his pale eyes finding hers across the distance. For a moment, she thought he might simply ignore her and continue his struggle. But frontier politeness ran deep, even in men who'd grown hard around the edges. "Afternoon, Mrs. Talbot," he replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who didn't use it often enough. "Fine day for a drive." "It is indeed." She made no move to dismount or approach, understanding instinctively that any offer of help would be rejected before she could finish speaking. Instead, she studied the problem with the professional eye of someone who solved mechanical puzzles for a living. The supply bag wasn't heavy. She could see that from the way it swayed in the gentle breeze. But its position on the horse's side, combined with the wheelchair's instability on uneven ground, created a situation where reaching it safely was nearly impossible. The obvious solution would be to move the horse, but that would require Eli to transfer back into the saddle, reposition Buck, and transfer back to the wheelchair complex, maneuver that would take considerable time and effort for such a simple goal. That bag giving you trouble? She asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing I can't handle." "Oh, I'm sure of that." Just wondering if you'd considered moving your chair to firmer ground before trying again. Looks like the wheels are settling into that soft patch there. He glanced down at his wheels, then back at her, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been gratitude for the tactful suggestion. Without acknowledging her words directly, he gripped the wheel rims and began working the chair backward, the muscles in his arms and shoulders straining against the soft earth's resistance. The wheelchair's design fought him at every turn. The wooden wheels, clearly built by someone with good intentions but limited understanding of engineering principles, were too narrow for the terrain and lacked any kind of tread pattern to provide grip. The frame, constructed from what appeared to be repurposed furniture lumber, creaked ominously under the stress of movement. Most problematic of all, the chair had no mechanism for locking the wheels, meaning that any slope or uneven surface turned it into an unpredictable vehicle with a mind of its own. Nora watched Eli struggle with the inadequate equipment and felt something crystallize in her mind. This wasn't just about one man's mobility. It was about dignity, independence, and the fundamental right to move through the world without constantly fighting your own tools. After several minutes of careful maneuvering, Eli managed to position his chair on more solid ground and successfully retrieve the supply bag. The simple task had taken nearly 10 minutes and left him breathing hard from the exertion, a sheen of perspiration visible on his forehead despite the cool air. "There you go," Nora said approvingly. "Sometimes it's all about finding the right angle." Eli secured the bag to his chair with practiced movements, but when he looked up at her again, she caught something unexpected in his expression. Not gratitude, exactly, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that she'd witnessed his struggle without trying to fix it for him or making him feel diminished by it. "Mrs. Talbot," he said after a moment, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you managing the forge work in your ... condition?" The question surprised her, both for its personal nature and for the genuine concern in his voice. "Carefully," she replied, "and with some modifications to my usual methods. When you can't do something the old way, you find a new way." Something shifted in his expression at those words, a subtle easing of the defensive walls he kept raised. "That's practical wisdom. My father used to say that problems are just solutions wearing disguises." Eli almost smiled at that. She saw the ghost of it at the corners of his mouth before it disappeared. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." He was. He also understood that the best tools are the ones designed for the job at hand, not just adapted from whatever happens to be available. The words hung in the air between them, and Nora realized she'd crossed into dangerous territory. She'd all but suggested that his wheelchair was inadequate, which was both true and potentially insulting. But instead of anger, she saw something else in Eli's eyes, a kind of desperate hope that he was trying very hard to suppress. "I suppose," he said carefully, "that someone with your skills might have thoughts on ... improvements to existing designs." "I might," she replied just as carefully, "though I'd need to understand the specific requirements better. Every job has its own challenges." They regarded each other in silence for a moment, two people circling around a conversation that could change everything or go nowhere at all. The autumn wind rustled through the aspens, sending a shower of golden leaves dancing across the road between them. "Mrs. Talbot," Eli said finally, "I want you to know that I don't accept charity. Never have, never will." "I understand that, Mr. Granger. I also understand the difference between charity and consulting work." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Consulting work?" "A person with specialized knowledge, sharing that knowledge with someone who has a particular problem to solve. Business, not charity." For the first time since she'd known of his existence, Eli Granger looked directly at her without the defensive wariness that usually clouded his features. What she saw there was intelligence, pain, and underneath it all, a spark of something that might have been hope. And what would someone charge for that kind of ... consulting? Nora considered the question. "Seriously. Depends on the complexity of the problem and the time required to solve it. But I've found that the best arrangements are the ones where both parties benefit. How would you benefit from helping a crippled gunfighter?" The bitterness in his voice made her chest tighten, but she kept her tone level. "I'd learn things. New techniques, different approaches to mechanical problems. And I'd have the satisfaction of creating something that's never been built before. Eli studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was sincere or simply kind. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because when he spoke again, the edge had gone out of his voice. "I'd be willing to discuss it," he said. "The consulting arrangement, I mean." "Good, though I should warn you that I work at my own pace and according to my own methods. I don't take direction well when it comes to my craft." That almost smile returned to his lips. "Mrs. Talbot, I spent 15 years dealing with horses, outlaws, and army quartermasters. I learned a long time ago not to tell experts how to do their jobs." As Nora prepared to continue on her way, she felt the weight of what had just occurred. They'd managed to negotiate around Eli's pride and her own desire to help, finding a middle ground that preserved his dignity while opening the door to something unprecedented. "Mr. Granger," she said, gathering her reins, "I'll need to think about this project, do some research. It might take a few weeks before I have anything concrete to propose. I've waited 4 years already, Mrs. Talbot. A few more weeks won't kill me." But as she drove away, Nora found herself wondering if that was really true. There had been something in Eli's eyes during their conversation, a kind of desperate hunger for change, for possibility, for the chance to be something more than a broken man marking time until death. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with her father's journal open before her and began sketching in earnest. The basic concept was clear: a wheeled chair designed specifically for a man who would never walk again, built to handle the rough terrain and weather conditions of frontier Colorado. But the details, those would require careful thought, precise engineering, and a level of craftsmanship that would challenge every skill she'd learned at her father's side. The baby stirred restlessly as she worked, as if sensing its mother's excitement and determination. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming. But inside, warmed by lamplight and possibility, Nora Talbot began designing something that had never existed before, a chair that wouldn't just carry a man from place to place, but might carry him back to the world of the living dot by the time she finally closed the journal and prepared for bed. The first rough sketches were complete. They showed a machine that was part wagon, part saddle, and part revolution, a device that could transform not just Eli Granger's mobility, but his entire relationship with the world around him. Whether she could actually build such a thing remained to be seen. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Nora Talbot had a project that excited her, a challenge worthy of her skills, and a purpose that went beyond simple survival. Tomorrow, she would begin gathering materials and researching techniques. Tonight, she would dream of wheels that rolled smooth as silk over any terrain, of frames strong enough to carry a man's hopes as well as his weight, and of the look in Eli Granger's eyes when he realized that his exile from the world was finally over. The first challenge Nora faced in her secret project wasn't technical. It was morning sickness that arrived with the reliability of sunrise and the persistence of summer drought. For 3 days after her encounter with Eli, she found herself doubled over the wash basin behind her forge at precisely 8:30 each morning, her body's rebellion against pregnancy making it impossible to focus on delicate metalwork until nearly noon. Dr. Henderson had assured her this was normal, even healthy, but normal didn't make it any less frustrating when she had wheels to design and metal to shape. She'd discovered that ginger tea helped settle her stomach, and Martha had taken to bringing her a steaming cup each morning along with the day's gossip and carefully disguised concern. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Martha observed on the 4th morning, watching Nora sip the fragrant tea with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to make sudden movements. "Dr. Henderson says you need more rest, especially in your condition." "Dr. Henderson worries too much," Nora replied, though she was grateful for the physician's attention. "And I can't afford to rest. Mrs. Patterson wants her kitchen knives sharpened. The Morrison boy needs new buckles for his harness, and old Tom Jenkins is still waiting for those replacement hinges." Asterisk, what she didn't mention was the project that had taken over her thoughts and filled page after page of her father's journal with increasingly complex sketches. The wheelchair design had evolved considerably since that first rough drawing shaped by practical considerations she hadn't initially anticipated. The wheels were the heart of the problem. Standard wagon wheels were far too large and heavy for a man to propel with his arms, while the narrow wooden wheels on Eli's current chair provided neither stability nor efficient rolling. What she needed was something between the two wheels large enough to roll smoothly over rough ground, but manageable enough for human power to move them effectively. She'd spent hours studying the wheels on various vehicles around Cedar Ridge, measuring diameters, examining spoke patterns, and considering how different designs handled different terrains. Jim Morrison's freight wagon used wheels nearly 5 feet in diameter with iron rims and 8 heavy spokes, perfect for carrying massive loads, but impossibly unwieldy for personal use. Martha's delivery cart had smaller wheels, perhaps 3 feet across, with 12 lighter spokes and leather padding where the driver's hands might touch them. But even Martha's cart wheels were designed to be pulled by a horse or mule, not pushed by human strength. What Nora needed was something entirely new: wheels, designed from the ground up for the specific task of carrying a man who would propel them with his own arms. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning while she was examining a broken baby carriage that Sarah Henderson had brought in for repair. The carriage's wheels were perhaps 18 inches in diameter, fitted with thin iron rims and delicate spokes that seemed almost toy-like compared to the massive wheels she'd been studying. But when she tested one of the wheels by spinning it on its axle, she was amazed by how smoothly and quietly it rotated, how little effort was required to keep it moving. Scale this up to perhaps 2 feet in diameter, strengthen the spokes and rim to handle a man's weight, and add some kind of gripping surface for hands, ... She began sketching immediately, her morning sickness forgotten in the excitement of discovery. The new design showed wheels that were large enough to roll over rocks and ruts, but small enough for a seated man to reach comfortably. The spokes would be iron rather than wood, providing strength without excessive weight. And the rim here was where her blacksmithing skills would be crucial, would feature a specially designed grip surface that would give Eli's hands purchase without tearing up his palms. But wheels were only part of the challenge. The frame that connected them needed to be strong enough to support a full-grown man, light enough for him to maneuver effectively, and stable enough to prevent dangerous tipping on uneven ground. Her father's journal contained detailed notes about load-bearing structures, stress distribution, and the properties of different metals under various conditions. Samuel Talbot had understood that every piece of iron had its own personality, its own strengths and weaknesses, and that successful metalwork required matching the material to the task. For the chair's frame, she would need iron that was both strong and flexible steel that could bend without breaking, absorb shocks without transferring them directly to the occupant. This meant working with higher-grade metal than she typically used for horseshoes and wagon repairs, material that would cost more and require more sophisticated techniques to shape properly. The expense worried her. The supplies for Eli's wheelchair would cost more than she typically spent in 2 months, money she could ill afford with a baby coming and no guarantee of steady income through the winter. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the look in his eyes when they discussed the consulting arrangement, that desperate hunger for change, barely contained beneath his careful composure. Martha noticed her preoccupation and began offering subtle assistance without being asked. Extra eggs appeared in Nora's larder, along with fresh bread and occasionally a jar of preserved peaches that were just going to go bad if someone didn't eat them soon. When Nora mentioned needing higher-grade steel, Martha quietly spread word among the ranchers that Nora Talbot was looking to buy premium materials for a special project, and within days, offers began arriving. Town Jenkins had salvaged some excellent steel from a wrecked freight wagon. Would Nora be interested in trading repair work for the metal? The Morrison Ranch had ordered too much spring steel for their new gate system. Perhaps Nora could use the excess? Even Father Miguel contributed, mentioning that the mission in Durango was planning to replace their chapel bell and would be happy to sell the old bronze to someone who could put it to good use. The community's support touched her more deeply than she'd expected. These people barely knew her personal business, but they understood that someone was working on something important, and that was enough to earn their help. It reminded her why she'd chosen to stay in Cedar Ridge after Thomas's death, rather than returning to her family in Kansas here. Neighbors looked out for each other without expecting explanations or gratitude. As October deepened into November, Nora's morning routine evolved to accommodate both her pregnancy and her secret project. She would arrive at the forge early, before the morning sickness hit, and use those precious hours for the delicate work of shaping wheel components. The spokes required particular precision. Each one had to be identical in length and thickness, fitted with small iron caps that would lock into specially drilled holes in the wheel hubs. The work was painstaking and occasionally frustrating. Her changing body affected her balance and reach, forcing her to modify techniques she'd been using for years. The weight of the hammer felt different in her hands, and she tired more quickly than usual. But there was something deeply satisfying about creating each perfect component, knowing that these pieces of shaped metal would soon become part of something that could transform a man's life. Dr. Henderson stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on her health, but clearly curious about the unusual work she was doing. She showed him her sketches one afternoon, explaining the principles behind the design without mentioning who it was intended for. "Fascinating," he murmured, studying the detailed drawings of wheel mechanisms and frame joints. "I've seen similar devices in medical journals from back east, but nothing this sophisticated. The engineering is quite impressive." "You think it will work?" "I think it will work beautifully, assuming it's built with the precision your drawings suggest." He looked at her seriously. "This kind of craftsmanship doesn't come cheap, Nora. Are you certain your client can afford such specialized work?" "We have an understanding," she replied carefully. "And some projects are worth doing regardless of the immediate profit." Dr. Henderson nodded, understanding more than she'd said. "Well, just remember that you're creating something that could genuinely change someone's life. That's not a responsibility to take lightly." The frame began taking shape in early November, forged from the premium steel Tom Jenkins had provided and shaped according to measurements she'd carefully estimated based on her observations of Eli. The main structure resembled a sturdy chair frame, but with crucial modifications: a lower center of gravity for stability, reinforced joints to handle the stress of constant movement, and attachment points for the wheel assemblies that would distribute weight evenly across the entire structure. Each evening, she would sit at her kitchen table with the journal, refining details and solving problems she hadn't anticipated. How should the seat be angled for maximum comfort during long periods of use? What kind of padding would provide cushioning without retaining moisture? How could she design the wheel mounting system to allow for easy maintenance and eventual replacement? The answers came slowly, through trial and error, careful observation, and the accumulated wisdom of her father's notes. Samuel Talbot had faced similar challenges when designing custom wagon components for ranchers with specific needs, and his solutions often applied to her current project with minor modifications. But the most important insights came from watching Eli himself during his occasional visits to town. She began timing her errands to coincide with his appearances, observing how he moved, what caused him difficulty, what adaptations he'd already made to his daily routine. She noticed that he favored his left arm for heavy lifting, suggesting an old injury to his right shoulder. She saw how he positioned his current wheelchair to minimize the effort required for transfers. Most importantly, she realized that his pride wasn't just stubbornness. It was armor against a world that saw him as broken rather than different. This wheelchair wouldn't just be about mobility. It would be about dignity, independence, and the fundamental human right to move through the world on your own terms. Every component she forged, every joint she welded, every detail she refined was a step toward giving Eli Granger his life back. The baby kicked strongly one evening as she worked on the seat padding design, reminding her that her own life was about to change dramatically. In a few months, she would be responsible for a helpless infant, her time and energy consumed by the demands of new motherhood. This project needed to be completed before then, not just for Eli's sake, but for her own sense of accomplishment. As November's first snow began to fall outside her kitchen window, Nora looked at the growing pile of wheelchair components in her workshop and felt a deep satisfaction. The wheels were nearly complete. The frame was taking its final shape, and the dozens of small parts that would connect everything together were accumulating in carefully organized boxes. Soon, very soon, she would wheel something unprecedented into Eli Granger's cabin and watch his face when he realized that his long exile from the world was finally over. The thought of that moment sustained her through the morning sickness, the aching back, the nights when sleep came hard, and the ever-present worry about money and the future. She was building more than a wheelchair. She was building hope, one carefully crafted piece at a time. The leather came from an unexpected source, Father Miguel's old saddle, worn beyond repair, but still containing pieces of the finest hide Nora had ever examined. The priest had appeared at her forge on a cold December morning, carrying the saddle over his shoulder like a burden he was finally ready to set down. "I've been watching your work," he said simply, settling the saddle on her workbench with reverent care. "This belonged to my father. He was a vaquero in New Mexico before he died, and this saddle carried him through 20 years of hard country. The leather has life left in it, even if the rest is finished." Nora ran her fingers over the worn hide, feeling the supple strength that came from years of careful conditioning and use. This wasn't the stiff, rough leather used for harnesses and work gear. This was saddle leather, cured and treated to remain flexible while supporting the weight of a rider through long days and rough terrain. "Father, this is beautiful work. Are you certain you want to part with it?" Miguel's dark eyes were warm but firm. "My father would have wanted it to serve someone who needed it. He always said that leather, like faith, grows stronger through service. Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "I suspect this project of yours is about more than just mechanics." She'd been working on the seat cushioning for weeks, experimenting with different materials and configurations. Wool stuffing was too. Soft and would compress quickly under daily use. Straw was resilient but uncomfortable. Cotton batting was expensive and would absorb moisture. But properly prepared saddle leather, layered and shaped over a wooden frame, could provide the perfect combination of support and comfort as winter tightened its grip on Cedar Ridge. Nora's workshop became a refuge of warmth and purpose. Forge burned constantly now, not just for her regular work, but for the intricate metalworking required by the wheelchair project. The seat frame had been particularly challenging, shaped from thin steel bars heated and bent to precise curves that would distribute weight evenly while maintaining comfort during extended use. Dr. Henderson had been invaluable during this phase, sharing his knowledge of human anatomy and the medical challenges faced by people with spinal injuries. He'd explained how prolonged sitting could cause pressure sores, how poor posture could lead to breathing difficulties, and how the right support could prevent secondary complications that often proved more dangerous than the original injury. "The angle of the seat back is crucial," he'd told her, studying her latest sketches by lamplight. "Too upright and he'll tire quickly. Too reclined and he'll have trouble with balance and upper body strength. You want something that supports good posture while allowing freedom of movement." These conversations had led to one of Nora's most innovative design features: a seat back that could be adjusted for different activities. Using a system of leather straps and metal brackets adapted from her father's notes on adjustable wagon seats, she'd created a backrest that could be modified for everything from long distance travel to close detail work. The wheels were complete now, and they exceeded even her own expectations. 2 feet in diameter with 12 iron spokes each, fitted with specially forged rims that featured a unique grip pattern, raised ridges that would give Eli's hands purchase without being harsh against his palms. The hubs were works of art in themselves, machined to tolerances that would have impressed the finest carriage makers in Denver. But it was the small details that truly set this wheelchair apart from anything that had been built before. Hand grips, shaped to fit human palms. A footrest that could be adjusted for different leg lengths. Storage compartments built into the frame for personal items. Even a small holder designed specifically for Eli's coffee cup. She'd noticed during his town visits that he always carried coffee and seemed to struggle with where to set it safely. Martha had become her unofficial assistant and confidant, dropping by the forge each morning with breakfast and staying to help with tasks that required an extra pair of hands. The older woman had proved surprisingly skilled at leatherwork, her fingers remembering techniques learned during her own frontier childhood when every family had to be self-sufficient. My mother always said that working with your hands was a form of prayer, Martha observed one morning, carefully stitching the final piece of seat padding. You're putting something of yourself into everything you create, and that becomes a gift to whoever uses it. I hope Eli sees it that way, Nora replied, adjusting the tension on a wheel spoke. I worry sometimes that he'll view this as charity, rather than ... rather than what it actually is. Which is? Martha smiled, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who'd watched human nature for more than 5 decades. A love letter written in steel and leather. The words made Nora's cheeks warm, but she couldn't deny their truth. Somewhere during the long hours of designing and building, her feelings for Eli Granger had evolved beyond simple compassion. She'd found herself thinking about him, not just as a man who needed help, but as someone she genuinely cared about his intelligence, his quiet dignity, the glimpses of humor she'd caught during their brief encounters. This realization both thrilled and terrified her. She was a pregnant widow with a business to run and a baby to prepare for. The last thing she needed was romantic complications, with a man whose past was written in gunpowder and whose future remained uncertain. Yet every time she shaped another component for his wheelchair, every time she solved another design challenge, she was acutely aware that she was creating something for Eli specifically, not just any disabled man, but this particular person, who'd somehow worked his way into her thoughts and heart. The community had begun to notice the changes in both Nora and Eli, though they were too polite to comment directly. Eli's visits to town had become more frequent and less furtive. He no longer positioned himself near the exit of every building, no longer seemed poised for immediate escape. When children ran past his wheelchair, he no longer flinched as if expecting harassment. Small changes, but significant ones to people who'd known him during his darkest periods. For her part, Nora had found new energy despite the advancing pregnancy. Her morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by what Dr. Henderson called the golden months of the second trimester. She felt strong, capable, and more focused than she'd been since Thomas's death. The wheelchair project had given her purpose beyond mere survival, and that sense of mission seemed to energize everything else in her life. It was during this period that she made a discovery that would prove crucial to the final design. While organizing her father's old papers, she found detailed drawings of a suspension system he'd developed for a custom medical wagon, a spring-mounted seat designed to provide a smooth ride for patients being transported over rough terrain. The principles could be adapted for a wheelchair, providing shock absorption that would make the device comfortable even on Cedar Ridge's rocky roads. The suspension system required precision metalwork beyond anything she'd attempted before. Each spring had to be carefully calibrated to provide the right amount of give for Eli's weight, and the mounting brackets had to be strong enough to handle the stress of constant movement over uneven ground. She spent 2 weeks perfecting the design, testing different spring tensions with makeshift weights and gradually refining the system until it worked with silky smoothness. Dr. Henderson was astounded when she demonstrated the completed suspension. Nora, this is remarkable. I've seen medical equipment in the finest hospitals back east that isn't this sophisticated. Where did you learn to engineer something like this? From my father's notes, mostly, and from thinking about what Eli needs, rather than what's been done before. You realize that this design could revolutionize mobility devices for disabled people everywhere? Have you considered documenting your innovations? The suggestion intrigued her, but it also raised questions she wasn't ready to address. For now, this wheelchair existed for one person, designed specifically for Eli's needs and circumstances. Whether it could be adapted for others was a consideration for the future. After she'd seen how well it worked for its intended user. As Christmas approached, the wheelchair was nearly complete. Only the final assembly and adjustment remained, tasks that would require Eli's presence to ensure proper fit and function. But she'd been carefully avoiding any direct contact with him, wanting the finished product to be a complete surprise. This strategy had worked well for maintaining secrecy, but it had also meant weeks without seeing him, without the small interactions that had become the bright spots in her routine. She found herself wondering how he was managing the increasingly harsh weather, whether his inadequate wheelchair was holding up, whether he was eating properly in his isolated cabin. These concerns came to a head on a snowy Thursday when Martha arrived at the forge with news that made Nora's heart race with worry. "Dr. Henderson says Eli hasn't been to town in over 2 weeks," Martha reported, stamping snow from her boots. "Tom Jenkins rode out to check on him yesterday, but that fool man wouldn't answer his door. Tom could see smoke from the chimney, so he's not frozen, but he's not taking care of himself properly," Nora finished, her hands automatically moving to her belly, where the baby was becoming increasingly active. "That's what we're thinking. Dr. Henderson's talking about going out there himself, but you know how Eli feels about medical attention." Nora looked at the wheelchair, so close to completion that she could almost see Eli using it. The thought of him suffering alone in his cabin, while his salvation sat finished but undelivered, was unbearable. How long would it take to get it ready? She asked herself as much as Martha. The wheelchair? A day's work, maybe 2 if you want everything perfect. Then that's what we'll do. It's time. That evening, working by lamplight with Martha's help, Nora completed the final assembly of Eli Granger's wheelchair. As she tightened the last bolts and adjusted the final straps, she felt a mixture of pride, excitement, and nervousness that made her hands tremble slightly. Tomorrow, she would load this marvel of engineering and compassion into her wagon and drive through the snow to Eli's cabin. Tomorrow, she would present him with something no frontier blacksmith had ever created before. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, she simply sat in her warm workshop, one hand on her growing belly, and the other resting on the smooth leather seat of a wheelchair that represented months of work, worry, and something deeper that she was finally ready to acknowledge as love. The morning Nora chose to deliver the wheelchair dawned gray and cold, with fresh snow falling in thick, silent flakes that muffled all sound and transformed Cedar Ridge into a crystalline wonderland. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill while her coffee grew cold in her hands, and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. The wheelchair sat in her workshop, covered by one of Thomas's old blankets, looking both magnificent and somehow vulnerable in the early morning light. Every component was perfect. She'd checked and rechecked every joint, every adjustment, every detail, until her eyes ached from the scrutiny. But perfection in engineering didn't guarantee acceptance from a proud man who'd spent 4 years learning to live with limitations. What if he saw it as pity? What if he rejected it outright? What if she'd misjudged everything about their careful conversations, and he ordered her off his property? The questions circled in her mind like winter wind around the eaves, persistent and unsettling. Martha arrived just after 7, stamping snow from her boots and carrying a basket that smelled of fresh biscuits and bacon. "Big day," she said simply, setting the basket on Nora's kitchen table and studying her friend's pale face. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad instead of giving a man the finest gift anyone's ever made in this territory." "What if he doesn't want it?" Nora asked, voicing the fear that had kept her awake most of the night. "What if I've presumed too much?" Martha poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove and settled into the chair across from Nora with the deliberate movements of someone who intended to stay until this conversation reached its proper conclusion. "Honey, I've lived in frontier communities for 40 years, and I've learned a few things about men and pride. You want to know what I think?" Nora nodded, needing wisdom from someone who'd watched human nature long enough to understand its patterns. "I think Eli Granger is sitting in that cabin right now, wondering if he imagined those conversations with you, wondering if you were just being polite when you talked about consulting work, wondering if he'll ever see you again, or if he'll spend the rest of his life staring at these 4 walls. Martha sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Pride can be a burden as much as a protection, and that man's been carrying his burden alone for too long. The baby kicked vigorously, as if agreeing with Martha's assessment, and Nora placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong movements that reminded her of her own changing circumstances. In a few months, she would be responsible for a helpless infant, entirely dependent on her ability to provide and protect. The wheelchair project had given her focus and purpose during these months of preparation. but it had also been a form of escape from the daunting reality of single motherhood. "I keep thinking about what happens after today," Nora admitted. "Once I give him the wheelchair, once he doesn't need my help anymore, ... what then?" Martha's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Nora Talbot, are you telling me you've spent 3 months building the most sophisticated piece of engineering this side of the Mississippi, just so you'd have an excuse to keep thinking about Eli Granger?" The accusation made Nora's cheeks warm, but she couldn't deny its essential truth. "Maybe. Partially. I don't know what I'm telling you. Then let me tell you something. That wheelchair isn't an ending. It's a beginning. It's not about him needing your help. It's about both of you being free to choose what comes next." By 9 o'clock, the snow had stopped, and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting the white landscape in shades of silver and gold. Nora hitched her mare to the wagon with Martha's help, both women working in companionable silence, broken only by the soft creak of leather and the occasional snort from the horse. Loading the wheelchair required careful maneuvering. Even with its sophisticated engineering, the device was substantial, built to last and function under demanding conditions. They wrapped it in blankets to protect the finish and positioned it in the wagon bed where it would be secure during the journey to Eli's cabin. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" Martha asked as Nora gathered the reins. "Moral support? Extra hands if you need them?" "Thank you, but this feels like something I need to do alone." Nora looked down at her friend from the wagon seat, grateful beyond words for the support and encouragement she'd received. "Besides, someone needs to mind the forge. Mrs. Patterson is supposed to pick up her knives this afternoon." The road to Eli's cabin wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing gradually into the foothills where the air grew thinner and the snow lay deeper. Nora had made this journey only once before, when she delivered some repair work to Tom, Jenkins's neighboring property, but she remembered the landmarks: the lightning split oak, the creek crossing marked by stacked stones, the meadow where elk sometimes grazed in the early morning. Eli's cabin sat in a small clearing overlooking the valley, positioned to catch the morning sun and shelter from the prevailing winds. It was a modest structure, built from local timber, with a stone chimney that was currently sending a thin stream of smoke into the crisp air. A small barn sat 50 yards away, and she could see Buck grazing in a paddock that had been cleared of snow dot. As her wagon approached, she saw movement. At the cabin's single window, a brief shadow that suggested Eli had noticed her arrival. By the time she'd brought her horse to a stop near the front porch, the cabin door had opened, and Eli sat framed in the doorway, his current wheelchair positioned carefully on the threshold. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face more gaunt, and she wondered if Martha's concerns about his self-care had been understated. But his eyes were alert and interested, without the defensive wariness she'd expected. "Morning, Mrs. Talbot," he called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "This is unexpected." "Morning, Mr. Granger. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I have something for you. The consulting project we discussed." His eyebrows rose slightly, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. "You actually built something?" "I did. Would you mind if I brought it inside? It's rather specialized, and I'd like to explain how it works." Eli maneuvered his wheelchair back from the doorway, creating space for her to enter. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished, but meticulously clean, a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that provided the only heat. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books that surprised her, as she noticed. Wood shavings scattered near the fireplace, suggesting he'd been carving something. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." "Thank you, but first I'd like to show you what I've made." Nora returned to the wagon, and with considerable effort, managed to extract the wheelchair and maneuver it up the porch steps. When she finally wheeled it through the cabin door, still covered by Thomas's blanket, Eli's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. "Mrs. Talbot, what exactly?" She pulled away the blanket with a flourish, revealing the wheelchair in all its polished glory. The morning sunlight streaming through the window caught the burnished steel frame, the carefully oiled leather seat, the precisely engineered wheels that represented months of careful planning and meticulous execution. Eli's reaction was everything she'd hoped for and more. His breath caught audibly, and his hands gripped the arms of his current wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles went white. For a long moment, he simply stared at the device, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. This is impossible," he whispered. "Nothing like this exists." "It does now," Nora replied simply. "Would you like to try it?" The transfer from his old wheelchair to the new one was a delicate process that required Eli to trust both her engineering and her discretion. She positioned the new chair alongside his current one and stepped back, allowing him to manage the transition himself, while remaining close enough to help if needed. When he finally settled into the leather seat and gripped the wheel rims the first time, the transformation was immediate and profound. The old wheelchair had forced him into an awkward, uncomfortable posture that emphasized his disability. The new one supported his body naturally, allowing him to sit with dignity and apparent comfort. "The wheels," he said, testing the grip patterns with his palms. "They're shaped for hands." "Everything is shaped for you," Nora replied. "The seat height, the back angle, the wheel spacing, all calculated based on your build and reach." Eli pushed gently on the wheel rims, and the chair responded with silky smoothness, rolling across the cabin floor with minimal effort. The suspension system absorbed the slight irregularities in the wooden planks, providing a ride so smooth it seemed to defy the rough construction of the frontier cabin. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just use it." For the next hour, she explained every feature and adjustment, demonstrating how the backrest could be modified for different activities, how the footrest could be positioned for maximum comfort, how the storage compartments could hold personal items securely. Eli absorbed every detail with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between adequate tools and excellent ones. When she'd finished the technical explanations, they sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of what had just occurred settling between them like snow on still water. The wheelchair represented more than mobility. It was a statement that Eli Granger's life had value, that his future held possibility, that someone had thought him worth months of careful work and considerable expense. "How much do I owe you?" he asked finally. "We discussed consulting work," Nora replied. "I've learned more from this project than I could have imagined. Consider it an even trade." "That's not possible. Materials alone must have cost." "Mr. Granger, if you insist on treating this as a commercial transaction, you'll insult both my craftsmanship and my intentions." He studied her face intently, as if trying to read the motivations behind her carefully neutral expression. "Then what are your intentions, Mrs. Talbot?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Nora felt the baby move restlessly, reminding her of the complications that lay ahead, the responsibilities that would soon consume her time and energy. "My intentions," she said carefully, "are to see good work put to its proper use. This wheelchair was designed for you, Mr. Granger. I hope it serves you well." As she prepared to leave, Eli wheeled the chair to the cabin's window and sat gazing out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression she'd never seen before. Not exactly happiness, but something approaching hope. The sight of him there, mobile and dignified in a way he hadn't been for 4 years, made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "Mrs. Talbot," he called as she reached the door. "Thank you." The simple words carried a weight of meaning that would stay with her during the entire journey back to Cedar Ridge. She'd given Eli Granger his mobility, but in the process, she'd discovered something about herself, that love could indeed be written in steel and leather, and that sometimes the greatest gifts were the ones that freed both the giver and the receiver to choose their own futures. 3 weeks after delivering the wheelchair, Nora discovered the wooden horse. She found it on her workbench one morning, nestled between her coffee cup and the stack of orders that seemed to grow larger each day despite the approaching winter. The carving was no bigger than her palm, but the detail was exquisite, every muscle defined, every curve flowing with the natural grace of a horse in motion. The wood had been sanded smooth as silk and finished with some kind of oil that brought out the grain's natural beauty. No note accompanied the gift, but none was needed. Only one person in Cedar Ridge possessed both the skill and the motivation to create such a thing. Martha found her examining the carving when she arrived with the morning's gossip and a fresh loaf of bread. "Well now," the older woman said, settling the bread on the counter and studying the horse with an appreciative eye. "That's fine work, very fine work indeed." "He made it for the baby," Nora said, running her finger along the horse's mane with reverent care. "How did he even know I was pregnant? I mean, really no, not just gossip, but enough to spend time carving a toy? Honey, Eli Granger may have been many things in his past life, but unobservant wasn't one of them. A man doesn't survive 15 years as a gunfighter without learning to notice details." Martha examined the carving more closely, admiring this craftsmanship. "Besides, he's been coming to town more regular since you gave him that wheelchair. Hard to miss a pregnant woman when you're actually looking at the world around you again." It was true. Eli's presence in Cedar Ridge had become a regular occurrence since receiving the wheelchair, though he maintained his preference for quiet interactions and quick departures. But the furtive, hunted quality that had characterized his previous visits had disappeared entirely. Now he moved through town with the calm confidence of a man who belonged there, who had business to conduct and places to be. Dr. Henderson had mentioned seeing him at the general store, carefully selecting supplies, with the methodical precision of someone planning for the future rather than simply surviving each day. Father Miguel reported that Eli had attended Sunday service twice, sitting near the back, but staying for the entire ceremony instead of his previous pattern of arriving late and leaving early. Most significantly, Tom Jenkins had hired him for odd jobs around the ranch repair work that took advantage of his excellent eye for detail and steady hands. The wheelchair's superior mobility had made it possible for Eli to access areas of the ranch that would have been impossible with his old equipment, and his work had proved so satisfactory that Jenkins was recommending him to other ranchers. "He's changing," Nora observed, still studying the wooden horse. "Not just physically, but deeper than that." "People do change when they're given reason to hope," Martha replied. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" A question had been haunting Nora for weeks. Her feelings for Eli had evolved far beyond the compassionate concern that had motivated the wheelchair project. She found herself thinking about him, constantly wondering how he was managing the increasingly harsh weather, whether he was eating properly, if he was lonely in that isolated cabin. When she spotted him in town, her heart rate increased, and she had to resist the urge to approach him with transparent excuses for conversation. But her pregnancy was advancing rapidly. Dr. Henderson estimated she was now 7 months along, and the physical demands of her condition were becoming impossible to ignore. Her energy flagged by mid-afternoon, her back ached constantly, and simple tasks like shoeing horses had become genuinely challenging. The thought of adding romantic complications to an already complex situation seemed both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know what I'm planning," she admitted. "I'm not sure I can plan anything right now. In 2 months, I'll have a newborn baby and no husband. That has to be my priority." Martha's expression softened with understanding. "Of course it does. But that doesn't mean you have to face it alone." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Billy Morrison, Jim's 12-year-old son, riding his pony at a pace that suggested urgency. He dismounted quickly and approached the forge with the breathless excitement of a boy carrying important news. "Mrs. Talbot, ma'am, my pa says to tell you that Mr. Granger wants to know if he'd be willing to look at his horse. Buck's been favoring his front left leg, and Mr. Granger thinks it might be a shoeing problem." The request surprised Nora. In all their previous interactions, Eli had been scrupulously careful to avoid asking for help or placing himself in her debt. For him to seek her professional services suggested either desperation or a significant shift in his thinking about their relationship. "When does he need this done?" she asked. "He said whenever it's convenient for you, Mom. But he'd be happy to bring Buck to your forge, if that would be easier." The offer to come to her was both practical and considerate, traveling to his cabin. while heavily pregnant would be uncomfortable and potentially risky if complications arose. But it also meant he would see her in her own environment, surrounded by the tools and evidence of her professional competence. Something about that prospect appealed to her. Tell Mr. Granger that tomorrow morning would be fine. Around 10 o'clock. After the forge has had time to heat properly. Billy nodded and remounted his pony, racing off with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd been entrusted with an important mission. Martha watched him disappear around the corner before turning back to Nora with an expression of barely contained amusement. Convenient excuse for a visit, she observed. It's legitimate business. Buck does need his shoes checked. I noticed him favoring that leg the last time I saw them in town. Oh, I'm sure it's completely legitimate. And I'm sure Eli Granger couldn't possibly have handled a simple shoeing problem himself, what with all that experience working around horses. Nora felt her cheeks warm, but couldn't argue with Martha's assessment. Eli undoubtedly possessed the knowledge and skill to handle basic horse care, which meant his request was motivated by something beyond mere necessity. That evening, she found herself taking unusual care with her appearance, braiding her hair more carefully than usual, and selecting her cleanest work dress. The effort felt simultaneously foolish and necessary. She wanted to look professional and competent, but she also couldn't deny wanting to look attractive for a man whose opinion had become increasingly important to her. The baby was particularly active that night, as if sensing its mother's nervous excitement. Nora lay in bed with her hands on her belly, feeling the strong kicks and movements that reminded her of how dramatically her life was about to change. In a few weeks, this restless energy would belong to a separate person, a tiny individual who would depend entirely on her for survival and care. The thought should have been overwhelming, but somehow the wooden horse on her bedside table made it seem less daunting. Someone was thinking about her future, planning for the arrival of her child, taking time to create something beautiful for a baby he'd never met. The gesture suggested possibilities she hadn't dared to consider, that perhaps she wouldn't have to face parenthood entirely alone. Eli arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, leading Buck with the careful attention of someone who understood horses and respected their welfare. The gelding was indeed favoring his front left leg, though not severely, and his movement suggested a shoeing issue rather than a more serious injury. "Morning, Mrs. Talbot," Eli said, removing his hat with the courteous formality that characterized all their interactions. "I appreciate you taking the time to look at him. Of course. Let's see what we're dealing with." Examining Buck revealed exactly what she'd expected, a loose shoe that was creating uneven pressure and minor discomfort. The fix would take perhaps 30 minutes and require heating the shoe to reshape it properly. Simple work, but it provided an excuse for extended conversation while the forge heated and the metal reached working temperature. "How's the wheelchair performing?" she asked, lighting the forge and adjusting the bellows to achieve proper heat. "Better than I imagined possible," Eli replied, positioning himself where he could watch her work while staying out of the way. "I've been able to take on some work for Tom Jenkins' repair jobs that were impossible with the old chair." "That's wonderful. It must feel good to be working again." "It does, more than I expected." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Mrs. Talbot, I owe you more than I can ever repay. That wheelchair hasn't just given me mobility. It's given me my life back." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "I'm glad it's proved useful." "Useful." He repeated the word as if testing its adequacy. That's one way to describe a miracle. As she worked on reshaping Buck's shoe, Eli told her about his recent activities, the repairs he'd completed for various ranchers, his plans to build furniture during the winter months when outdoor work became impossible, his growing sense that he might actually have a future worth planning for. His voice carried a warmth and animation she'd never heard before, and she realized that the man she was talking to bore little resemblance to the bitter, isolated figure she'd first encountered months ago. "I've been thinking about expanding," he said as she fitted the heated shoe to Buck's hoof. "Maybe advertising my services more widely. There's good money in custom woodwork if you have the skills and the tools." "You certainly have the skills. I've seen your carving." He looked pleased that she'd noticed. "The horse? I wasn't sure if you'd. I hope it's appropriate. For the baby, I mean. It's beautiful. The most beautiful thing I've ever been given. The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed ready to address directly. But something had shifted in their dynamic, a subtle movement from formal courtesy towards something warmer and more personal. As she finished Buck's shoeing and checked the fit, Eli made another unexpected request. Mrs. Talbot, I know this is presumptuous, but I've been wondering, would you be willing to accept a commission? What kind of commission? A cradle for your baby. He spoke quickly, as if the words might lose courage if delayed. I know you're perfectly capable of building one yourself, but I'd like to contribute something. To thank you, and to help welcome the child into the world. The offer touched her more deeply than she'd expected. A cradle was intimate, personal something that would hold her baby during its most vulnerable months. Something she would see and use dozens of times each day. For Eli to want to create such a thing suggested feelings that went far beyond gratitude. That's very generous, she replied carefully. But I couldn't ask you to ... You're not asking. I'm offering. Please. The word hung between them, raw with emotion that transformed a simple request into something approaching the plea. Looking at his face, Nora saw not the feared gunfighter or the broken man, but someone who desperately wanted to be part of something hopeful and life-affirming. Yes, she said simply. I would be honored to commission a cradle from you. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, sudden, brilliant, and transformative. In that moment, Nora realized that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond gratitude or professional respect. They were two people who'd found each other in unexpected circumstances, drawn together by need and circumstance, but held together by something deeper and more enduring. As Eli prepared to leave, leading Buck with his newly fitted shoe, he paused at the forge entrance and looked back at her with an expression of such tender concern that it took her breath away. Mrs. Talbot, please take care of yourself. You single quotes important to more people than you might realize. After he'd gone, Nora stood in her forge holding the wooden horse and thinking about cradles, about the future, about the possibility that loneliness might not be an inevitable part of single motherhood. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Cedar Ridge, but inside her workshop, warmed by the forge and hope in equal measure, spring seemed closer than the calendar suggested. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Snow fell steadily outside Nora's kitchen window, the kind of gentle, persistent snowfall that would accumulate throughout the day without seeming urgent or threatening. She sat at her table, sipping ginger tea and planning her work schedule around the increasing limitations of her pregnancy, when the sound of wheels on snow drew her attention to the window. Eli approached in his wheelchair, moving with the confident efficiency that still amazed her after months of watching his transformation. But something was different today. His posture was tense, his movement hurried, and he carried a canvas bag clutched tightly against his chest as if it contained something precious or dangerous. She opened the door before he could knock. Immediately, noting the strain in his face and the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line behind him. Mrs. Talbot, he said without preamble, I need to speak with you. It's important. Of course. Please, come in. He maneuvered the wheelchair through her doorway with practiced ease, but once inside, he seemed unable to settle. His hands gripped and released the wheel rims repeatedly, and she noticed a fine tremor in his fingers that spoke of deep agitation. Coffee? She offered, but he shook his head. Ma'am, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to change how you see me, probably how everyone in Cedar Ridge sees me. But you have a right to know, especially given. He gestured vaguely toward her belly, toward the cradle he'd been building, toward the delicate relationship that had been growing between them. Nora settled into the chair across from him, her hands instinctively moving to rest on her rounded belly where the baby had been unusually quiet all morning. Eli, whatever it is, you can tell me. He opened the canvas bag with careful deliberation and withdrew a crumpled wanted poster, its edges worn and stained from years of handling. The paper bore his photograph, younger, harder, with eyes that held none of the warmth she'd grown accustomed to, and text that made her breath catch. Wanted, dead or alive. Eli Granger, known as the Granger Ghost. Robbery, murder, assault. Reward, $500. She studied the poster, then looked up at his face, trying to reconcile the man she knew with the criminal described on the yellowed paper. This is from before you were paralyzed. Yes, but that's not the whole story. His voice was steady, but she could see the cost of this revelation in the rigid line of his shoulders. Mrs. Talbot Nora, I was never just a gunfighter. I was an outlaw, a thief. And the man who shot me wasn't just any enemy. He was my partner. The words hung in the air like smoke from the forge, acrid and unavoidable. Nora felt the baby stir restlessly, as if responding to her elevated heart rate, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Tell me, she said simply. Eli's story unfolded slowly, painfully, like a wound being cleaned. He'd fallen into outlawry. During the chaos following the war between the states, when young men with military training but no prospects had drifted west seeking fortune or purpose. He'd partnered with Jake Murdoch, a charismatic leader who specialized in bank robberies and train holdups throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories. Jake was smart, Eli said, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving painful memories. He planned everything perfectly: routes, timing, targets. We never killed anyone who didn't draw on us first, never robbed from folks who couldn't afford to lose it. We told ourselves we were different from the animals who terrorized honest people. But you weren't different. No, we were thieves, and thieves hurt people whether they mean to or not. He reached into the bag again and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal against metal. This is what's left of my share from our last job. $3,000 in gold coins, stolen from the First Bank of Durango. Nora stared at the pouch, understanding beginning to dawn. The shooting. Jake decided he didn't want to split the money anymore. Set up an ambush in Dead Horse Canyon. Brought along 2 men I'd never seen before. They shot me 6 times and left me for dead, but they were in a hurry, didn't stick around to make sure I stayed dead. The room fell silent except for the soft whisper of snow against the windows and the steady tick of the mantel clock. Nora absorbed this information, trying to understand its implications not just for her growing feelings toward Eli, but for the safety of her unborn child and the community that had welcomed her after Thomas's death. Why are you telling me this now? She asked finally. Eli's hands tightened on the wheelchair's armrests. Because Jake Murdoch is still alive, still active, and still wants this gold. More than that, he wants me dead, properly dead this time. Tom Jenkins heard rumors in Durango last week. Jake's been asking questions about a crippled gunfighter, showing old photographs, offering money for information. You think he's coming here. I know he's coming here. The only question is when. Eli leaned forward, his pale eyes intense with urgency. Nora, I've been selfish. I should have left Cedar Ridge the moment you gave me that wheelchair. Should have taken this gold and disappeared somewhere Jake could never find me. But I couldn't bear to leave, couldn't bear to go back to being alone. The admission hit her like a physical blow. She'd been right about his feelings, about the connection growing between them, but the circumstances were far more dangerous than she'd imagined. What does Jake want, exactly? The gold, obviously, but also revenge. He believes I betrayed him. Somehow, that I was planning to cut him out of future jobs. It's not true, but Jake's never been particularly interested in truth when revenge is more satisfying. Nora stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful snow-covered landscape that suddenly seemed full of hidden threats. Her pregnancy made her feel vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced before, not just physically, but emotionally. The thought of bringing a child into a world where violent men might arrive at any moment was terrifying. How many men does he typically travel with? 3 or 4, usually, all experienced, all dangerous. The kind of men who enjoy their work a little too much. Eli's voice carried the weight of intimate knowledge. Nora, I'm going to leave. Tonight. If possible. I'll take the gold and disappear, lead them away from here. In a wheelchair? In winter? Through mountain country? She turned from the window to face him, struck by the impossibility of what he was proposing. Eli, that's suicide. Maybe. But it's better than bringing violence to innocent people. Better than risking harm to you and your baby. The protective instinct in his voice touched something deep in her chest, but it also sparked a stubborn determination. That surprised her with its intensity. Running isn't the answer. You'll freeze to death in the mountains, and Jake will just follow your trail right back here anyway. Then what do you suggest? Nora found herself thinking with the strategic clarity that had always emerged during crisis. Thomas's death had taught her that problems rarely solved themselves, that survival often required making difficult decisions with incomplete information. First, we tell Dr. Henderson and Father Miguel. They have a right to know what might be coming. Then we tell Martha she's got more common sense than the rest of us combined, and she knows how to keep people calm during trouble. And then we prepare. Jake wants you and the gold, but he doesn't know about the wheelchair. He's expecting to find a helpless cripple, not a man who can move and fight on his own terms. Eli's expression shifted from despair to something approaching hope. You're suggesting I make a stand. I'm suggesting we make a stand. This is my community too, Eli. My child is going to grow up here. I won't have outlaws thinking they can terrorize honest people without consequences. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the kitchen table, the weight of decisions settling between them like snow, accumulating on a windowsill. When Eli finally spoke, his voice carried a resolve she hadn't heard before. Nora, if we do this, if we face Jake together, there's no going back. Win or lose, everything changes after that. Everything's already changed, she replied, one hand resting on her belly, and the other reaching across the table to cover his. The question is whether we change it together or let someone else change it for us. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and calloused and steady despite the danger approaching their peaceful community. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside Nora's kitchen, two people who'd found love in unexpected circumstances began planning for a confrontation that would determine not just their survival, but their future. The baby kicked strongly, as if approving of its mother's decision to fight rather than flee. Nora smiled at the sensation, thinking that this child would be born into a world where people stood up for each other, where love was worth defending, and where courage could be found in the most unlikely places. Jake Murdoch was coming to Cedar Ridge, but he would find more than a helpless cripple and stolen gold. He would find a community prepared to defend itself, a man who'd learned to fight from a wheelchair, and a pregnant woman who discovered that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you chose to fight rather than the ones that chose you. The wanted poster lay on the table between them, a reminder of past sins and present dangers. But beside it sat the wooden horse Eli had carved for her unborn child, a symbol of hope, creativity, and the possibility that even the most damaged souls could find redemption through love and sacrifice. Tomorrow, they would begin preparing for war. Tonight, they would plan for peace. The town bell had never been used for anything more urgent than announcing Sunday services and the occasional social gathering. But on the morning Jake Murdoch's gang rode into Cedar Ridge, its bronze voice carried across the settlement with the authority of imminent danger. Nora heard it from her forge, where she'd been making final adjustments to a special holster mount Eli had requested for his wheelchair. The sound sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the February cold, and she immediately began following the plan they'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. The preparations had been methodical and thorough. Dr. Henderson had converted his clinic into a makeshift command post, with supplies and equipment positioned for treating wounded while maintaining clear sight lines to the street. Father Miguel had organized the evacuation of families with young children to the mission's basement, a stone-walled sanctuary that could withstand gunfire if the worst occurred. Martha had proved invaluable, using her network of relationships to quietly spread information and coordinate responses without creating panic. The general store had been reinforced with sandbags and extra ammunition, while strategic positions throughout town had been prepared with supplies and cover for anyone who chose to make a stand. But the most crucial preparation had been Eli himself. Wheelchair that Nora had originally designed for mobility had been transformed into something unprecedented, a mobile fighting platform that took advantage of his unique situation rather than being limited by it. Working together, they'd modified the frame to support a specially designed holster that allowed him to draw and fire his Colt .45 with devastating efficiency while maintaining perfect balance and control. The wheelchair's low profile made him a difficult target, while its superior maneuverability allowed him to change positions quickly and unpredictably. Most importantly, Jake Murdoch and his men were expecting to find a helpless cripple. They had no idea they'd be facing an adversary who'd learned to fight in ways they couldn't anticipate. Nora heard the bell's third toll and felt her first contraction, a tightening across her belly that made her gasp and grip the edge of her workbench. The timing was impossibly cruel. Her labor was beginning just as the community faced its greatest danger. "Not now," she whispered to her unborn child. "Please, not now." But biology rarely accommodated human plans, and the second contraction followed 15 minutes later, stronger than the first and impossible to ignore. She made her way carefully to Dr. Henderson's clinic, where Martha was already positioned, with medical supplies and a determined expression. "The baby's coming," Nora announced without preamble. Martha's eyes widened, but her response was immediate and practical. "How far apart are the contractions?" 15 minutes, maybe less. First babies usually take their time, but stress can speed things up. Martha helped Nora to the examining table that Dr. Henderson had prepared for exactly this possibility. "Can you handle being moved if we need to get you to safety?" "I'm not going anywhere," Nora replied firmly. "This is my community, my fight. The baby will have to be born here." Through the clinic window, she could see Eli positioning himself. In the town square, his wheelchair angled to provide optimal visibility and mobility. He'd insisted on being the most visible target, drawing Jake's attention away from the civilians who might get caught in crossfire. The strategy was sound but terrifying. Jake Murdoch was reportedly fast with a gun, experienced in violence, and motivated by 4 years of festering anger. Eli had skill and preparation on his side, but he also had limitations that no amount of engineering could entirely overcome. Dr. Henderson burst through the clinic door, his face flushed from running. They're at the north end of Main Street. 4 riders, heavily armed, asking about a crippled gunfighter and stolen gold. Another contraction gripped Nora, stronger than the previous ones, and she breathed through it with the focused determination of someone who'd learned that pain was temporary, but surrender was permanent. When it passed, she found both Martha and Dr. Henderson staring at her with concern. "How long?" Dr. Henderson asked professionally. "Could be hours, could be minutes. First babies are unpredictable." Martha squeezed Nora's hand. "But she's strong. And the baby's positioned well. We'll manage whatever happens." Through the window, they watched Jake Murdoch's gang advance slowly down Main Street, their horses stepping carefully through the snow, while the riders scanned buildings and shadows with the wariness of men who'd survived by expecting trouble. Jake himself was unmistakable tall, lean, with the kind of predatory grace that marked truly dangerous men. Father Miguel appeared in the clinic doorway, his brown robes dusted with snow. "The families are secure in the mission basement. Tom Jenkins and Jim Morrison are positioned behind the bank with rifles. Everyone else is in place according to the plan." "And Eli?" Nora asked, though she could see him from the window. "Ready," Father Miguel replied simply. "He asked me to tell you that whatever happens, the cradle is finished. It's waiting in his cabin." The words hit Nora harder than any contraction. Eli had completed his gift for her baby, ensuring that something beautiful would survive regardless of the day's outcome. The gesture spoke of love, hope, and a faith in the future that humbled her. Jake's voice carried clearly across the winter air as his gang reached the center of town. "Eli Granger, I know you're here somewhere. You son of a bitch. Come out and face me like a man." The challenge echoed off the buildings, stark and brutal in the crisp morning air. For a moment, the settlement seemed frozen in time, snow falling gently, smoke rising from chimneys, the ordinary rhythms of frontier life suspended while violence gathered like a storm front. Then Eli's wheelchair emerged from behind Martha's general store, rolling smoothly across the packed snow with the silent efficiency that had amazed Nora from the first day she'd seen it in action. He positioned himself in the middle of the street, perhaps 50 yards from Jake's position, close enough for conversation, but far enough to provide maneuvering room. "Hello, Jake," Eli called out, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd faced death before and found it less frightening than expected. "You're looking well for a man who's been living on the wrong side of the law." Jake's laughter was harsh and bitter. "And you're looking better than I expected for a dead man. Though I see my boys didn't finish the job properly." "Your boys are buried in Dead Horse Canyon. Coyotes probably scattered the bones by now." The casual reference to the fate of Jake's accomplices sent a visible ripple of tension through the remaining gang members. They shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons, the easy confidence of their approach beginning to crack. Nora felt another contraction building and gripped Martha's hand tightly, breathing through the intensity while trying to maintain focus on the drama unfolding outside. The contractions were coming faster now, perhaps 10 minutes apart, but she couldn't afford to lose concentration during the critical moments ahead. "You cost me 4 years, Eli," Jake continued, urging his horse a few steps closer. 4 years of running, hiding, wondering when you'd surface with evidence that could hang me. But you never did you? Just disappeared like the ghost everyone said you were. I had other priorities, like stealing my gold." Eli's response was a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Your gold? That's interesting. I seem to remember doing half the work on that bank job. You were supposed to be dead. Dead men don't get shares." The conversation continued, but Nora found herself focusing more on the positioning and movement of the various participants than on their words. Jake's men had spread out slightly, creating a loose semicircle that would allow them to surround Eli if the situation deteriorated into gunplay. But they were also bunched close enough together that a strategic retreat could split their formation. Eli, meanwhile, had positioned his wheelchair to take advantage of the slight slope in the street, giving him potential momentum for rapid movement, while maintaining clear firing lanes in multiple directions. Most importantly, his current position put the bulk of the town's buildings behind him, minimizing the risk of stray bullets hitting civilians. "You always were too clever for your own good," Jake said, drawing his revolver with the fluid motion of long practice. "But clever doesn't stop bullets." "No," Eli agreed, his own gun appearing in his hand with speed that made Jake's eyes widen. "But being faster does." The moment stretched like a wire under tension, 2 gunfighters facing each other across a snow-covered street, while the entire community held its breath. Nora felt the beginning of another contraction and found herself caught between the intimate urgency of impending birth and the life-and-death drama playing out beyond the window. Then Jake's nerve broke, and he went for his gun. What happened next would be discussed in Cedar Ridge for decades to come. Eli's wheelchair gave him stability that a standing man couldn't match, allowing him to draw and fire with mechanical precision, while Jake's horse shifted nervously under the sudden movement. The first shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him in his saddle and spoiling his aim. The street erupted in gunfire as Jake's remaining men opened up, but they were shooting at a target unlike anything they'd encountered before. Eli's wheelchair spun and darted with fluid grace, presenting an impossible target, while his return fire was devastatingly accurate. Nora watched in amazement as her engineering created possibilities that neither she nor Eli had fully anticipated. The wheelchair's low center of gravity allowed impossible maneuvers, while its silent movement made it difficult for opponents to track by sound. Most crucially, it transformed Eli from a stationary target into something approaching a force of nature. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained more violence than Cedar Ridge had seen in its entire 7-year existence. When the smoke cleared, Jake Murdoch lay motionless in the snow, and his surviving gang members were fleeing north toward the mountains. Their taste for violence thoroughly exhausted. Eli sat in his wheelchair in the middle of the street, unhurt but breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. Around him, the people of Cedar Ridge began emerging from their defensive positions, their faces reflecting wonder, relief, and something approaching awe.*. Nora felt the strongest contraction yet grip her body, and this time there was no mistaking its significance. Her labor was advancing rapidly, spurred by the stress and excitement of the morning's events. "Martha," she gasped, "I think it's time." Martha took one look at her face and began issuing rapid orders to Dr. Henderson, who immediately shifted from community defender to attending physician. As they prepared for the birth of Nora's child, she could see Eli through the window, surrounded by grateful townspeople, but looking toward the clinic with an expression of desperate concern. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw in his face everything she'd hoped to see: love, devotion, and an absolute commitment to the future they would build together. The baby kicked strongly, as if eager to be born into a world where courage had triumphed, where love had found a way, and where two damaged souls had discovered that redemption was possible when you had someone worth fighting for. Outside, snow continued to fall on a settlement that had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger than before. Inside the clinic, Nora Talbot prepared to bring new life into a world that suddenly seemed full of hope and endless possibility. Final confrontation between Eli and Jake unfolded with the brutal efficiency of men who'd spent years perfecting the art of violence. But the wheelchair transformed the encounter into something unprecedented in the annals of frontier gunfighting. Jake's first shot went wide as his horse shied from the sudden movement, the bullet splintering wood from the general store's front porch. Eli's response was immediate and devastating, a perfectly placed shot that shattered Jake's gun hand, sending the revolver spinning into the snow while blood sprayed across the white landscape. "Son of a bitch!" Jake screamed, clutching his mangled hand against his chest while his horse danced nervously beneath him. "Kill him! Kill the bastard!" His remaining 3 men opened fire simultaneously, their bullets kicking up snow and dirt around Eli's position. But they were shooting at a target unlike anything they'd encountered before, a man whose mobility wasn't limited by legs that could be shot out from under him, whose balance remained perfect regardless of wounds or fear. The wheelchair spun, left with fluid grace, Eli's hands working the wheel rims with the precision of a pianist, while his gun tracked targets with mechanical accuracy. His second shot took down Jake's lieutenant, a scarred man named Pete Dalton, who'd been wanted in 3 territories for murder and robbery. The bullet caught Dalton's center mass, pitching him backward off his horse to lie motionless in the snow. Inside the clinic, Nora gripped Martha's hand with crushing force as another contraction peaked, her breathing carefully controlled despite the violence erupting just outside the window. Dr. Henderson worked with steady competence, his medical training allowing him to focus on the immediate task while gunfire echoed through the morning air. "How much longer?" Nora gasped between contractions. "Not long now," Dr. Henderson replied, though his attention was divided between his patient and the battle that would determine their community's survival. The baby's crowning. "On the next contraction, I need you to push with everything you have." Through the window, she could see Eli maneuvering his wheelchair with impossible skill, using the device's low profile and superior mobility to outflank opponents who'd expected to corner a helpless cripple. The holster mount she designed allowed him to draw and fire without compromising his balance, while the wheelchair's silent movement made it difficult for enemies to track his position by sound. Jake's third man, a young outlaw named Billy Carson, whose reputation was built more on cruelty than skill, panicked under Eli's relentless precision. He spurred his horse toward the clinic, perhaps thinking to take hostages, or simply seeking escape from the nightmare. His easy job had become Eli anticipated the move, his wheelchair cutting across Carson's path with predatory grace. The outlaw's horse reared as the chair appeared suddenly in its path, throwing Carson to the ground where he landed hard, his rifle spinning away across the snow. "Please," Carson gasped, raising his hands as Eli's gun centered on his chest. "I give up. Don't shoot." Eli's response was terse, but not without mercy. "Run. If I see you in Colorado territory again, I'll finish what we started here." Carson scrambled to his feet and fled on foot toward the mountains, leaving behind his horse, his weapons, and any pretense of outlaw courage. His departure left only Jake and one remaining gunman, grizzled veteran named Frank Hooper, whose reputation for violence was matched only by his loyalty to the man who paid his wages. The contraction hit Nora with overwhelming intensity, and she bore down with every ounce of strength she possessed, her world narrowing to the immediate urgency of bringing her child safely into the world. She could hear Dr. Henderson's encouraging words, feel Martha's steady support, but her consciousness was consumed by the primal effort of birth. Outside, Jake had managed to draw a backup pistol with his undamaged left hand, though his accuracy was compromised by pain and unfamiliarity with offhand shooting. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes burned with the fanatical intensity of a man who'd rather die than admit defeat. "You always were lucky, Eli," Jake called out, steadying his gun against his saddle horn. "But luck runs out eventually." "This isn't luck," Eli replied, positioning his wheelchair for optimal cover behind a horse trough while maintaining clear firing lines. "This is preparation meeting opportunity." Frank Hooper tried to flank Eli's position, but the wheelchair's mobility allowed rapid repositioning that kept both remaining outlaws in front of him. The device that had been designed to restore dignity and independence had become an instrument of tactical superiority, transforming its user from vulnerable target to apex predator. Hooper's shot went high, splintering a window frame above Eli's head. The return fire was instantaneous and fatal, dropping the veteran gunman with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Hooper's horse bolted, dragging his body 20 yards before the boot, caught in his stirrup, finally worked loose. That left only Jake, wounded and desperate, facing a man who'd already demonstrated superior skill and equipment. The smart play would have been surrender, but Jake Murdoch hadn't survived 15 years of outlawry by making smart plays when pride was at stake. "Just you and me now," Jake snarled, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his wounded hand, the way it should have been in Dead Horse Canyon. Eli's response was calm, almost conversational. "Jake, it doesn't have to end this way. Drop the gun, accept arrest, and you might live to see trial. And hang in Denver? I don't think so." Inside the clinic, Nora felt the moment of transformation as her baby finally emerged into the world. Dr. Henderson's hands were gentle but sure as he lifted the infant, and the child's first cry was strong and healthy, a sound of pure life that seemed to banish the violence and death from the morning air. "It's a boy," Dr. Henderson announced, his voice filled with wonder despite having delivered dozens of babies throughout his career. "A beautiful, healthy boy." The words reached Nora through a haze of exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. Her son Thomas's son had been born into a world where good people stood up to evil, where communities protected their own, and where love could triumph over fear and violence. Martha cleaned the baby with efficient tenderness while Dr. Henderson attended to the final stages of delivery. Through the window, Nora could see that the gunfight was reaching its climax. Jake and Eli facing each other across perhaps 30 yards of snow-covered street, like figures from some ancient drama about justice and redemption. Jake's final shot was driven more by desperation than skill, the bullet passing harmlessly to Eli's left, while his own aim remained true. The slug took Jake high in the chest, pitching him sideways off his horse to land heavily in the snow, where he lay gasping like a landed fish. Eli rolled his wheelchair forward slowly, his gun trained on the fallen outlaw, but his posture suggesting the fight had gone out of him. When he reached Jake's side, the outlaw was still breathing but barely conscious, his eyes unfocused and his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Should have stayed dead," Jake whispered, blood frothing at his lips. "Should have ... left the gold alone." "Maybe," Eli replied quietly. "But then I never would have learned what I was really capable of becoming." Jake's eyes closed for the final time, and the violence that had haunted both men for years finally came to its inevitable conclusion. Around them, the people of Cedar Ridge began emerging from their defensive positions, their faces reflecting amazement, relief, and something approaching reverence for what they'd witnessed. Dr. Henderson wrapped Nora's son in a clean blanket and placed him in her arms, the baby's tiny face peaceful despite the drama that had marked his entrance into the world. Outside, She could see Eli sitting in his wheelchair beside Jake's body, his head bowed as if in prayer, or simply overwhelming exhaustion. The battle was over, but Nora understood that this was just the beginning. Her son would grow up in a community that had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger, raised by people who'd chosen courage over safety and principle over convenience. And if she had anything to say about it, he would also be raised by a man who'd learned that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. Through the clinic window, her eyes met Eli's across the blood-stained snow, and she saw in his face everything she'd hoped to see: love, devotion, and an absolute commitment to the future they would build together. The wooden horse he'd carved sat on the table beside her bed, but soon there would be a cradle, and perhaps someday a home where three people who'd found each other in unexpected circumstances could create something beautiful from the wreckage of their past. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound and strange, broken only by the gentle whisper of falling snow and the soft sounds of Nora's newborn son settling into his first sleep. Cedar Ridge seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire community was processing the transformation from ordinary frontier settlement to the site of something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Eli sat motionless in his wheelchair beside Jake Murdoch's body, his smoking revolver still held loosely in his right hand. The contrast between the violence just concluded and the peaceful domesticity visible through the clinic window seemed to encompass the entire range of human possibility: death and birth, destruction and creation, the end of one story and the beginning of another. Dr. Henderson finished his examination of both mother and child, pronouncing them healthy and strong despite the extraordinary circumstances of the delivery. "He's perfect, Nora," the physician said, genuine wonder in his voice. 8 pounds, strong heartbeat, clear lungs. A fighter, just like his mother. Nora cradled her son against her chest, marveling at the tiny perfection of his features and the warm weight of his small body. He had Thomas's dark hair and what appeared to be her own stubborn chin, but his eyes, when they fluttered open briefly, held an alertness that seemed almost preternatural, as if he'd been paying attention to everything that had occurred during his dramatic entrance into the world. Through the window, she watched as Father Miguel approached Eli's position, his brown robes dark against the snow. The priest knelt beside Jake's body, offering last rites with the same compassion he would have shown any soul departing this world, regardless of the sins that had marked their living. Eli bowed his head respectfully during the brief ceremony, his own complicated relationship with mortality and redemption playing across his weathered features. Tom Jenkins and Jim Morrison emerged from their defensive positions behind the bank, rifles held at ready as they scanned the settlement for any remaining threats. The bodies of Jake's gang lay scattered across Main Street like grim punctuation, marks in a story about the price of choosing violence over peace. 4 men, Martha observed, joining Nora at the window while maintaining a careful watch on the Conde baby. 4 men rode into our town thinking they could take whatever they wanted, hurt whoever they pleased. They learned different. Dr. Henderson was checking his medical bag, preparing to treat anyone who might have been wounded during the firefight. "I should go see if Eli needs attention. He took quite a risk out there, could have been shot in a dozen different ways." "He wasn't, though," Nora said softly, her eyes never leaving the figure in the wheelchair. "The chair worked exactly as we designed it to work. Maybe better." It was true. The wheelchair had performed beyond even her most optimistic projections, transforming a man with significant physical limitations into someone who could not only defend himself, but protect an entire community. The engineering had been sound, but the real breakthrough had been psychological, giving Eli the tools he needed to stop seeing himself as a victim and start seeing himself as someone capable of heroic action. Martha squeezed Nora's shoulder gently. "That man's been carrying guilt and shame for 4 years, thinking he was nothing but a burden on the world. Today he learned different. Today he learned he could still be someone worth admiring." The baby stirred in Nora's arms, making the small, mewling sounds that newborns use to announce their presence to the world. She looked down at her son's face and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This child would grow up knowing that his mother had stood her ground when evil came calling. that his father figure had faced down murderers to keep innocent people safe. Eli finally stirred from his contemplative stillness, holstering his weapon, and beginning to roll his wheelchair toward the clinic. His movement was careful and deliberate, as if he was carrying something precious and fragile that might be damaged by sudden motion. When he reached the clinic door, he paused and looked through the window with an expression of such tender longing that it took Nora's breath away. Dr. Henderson opened the door before Eli could knock. "Come in, son. Let me check you for wounds while you meet the newest member of our community." Eli maneuvered his wheelchair through the doorway with the fluid grace that had become second nature, but there was something different about his bearing. Now a confidence and peace that hadn't been there before the confrontation. He'd faced the worst of his past and emerged victorious, not just in combat, but in the deeper battle for his own soul. "Nora," he said simply, removing his hat as he approached her bedside. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle in her arms, and she saw wonder replace the hardness that had marked his features for so long. "Is he?" "He's perfect," she replied, adjusting the blanket so Eli could see the baby's face more clearly. "Born during the fighting, as if he couldn't wait to join the world." Eli stared at the infant with the reverent attention of someone witnessing a miracle. When the baby's eyes opened and seemed to focus on his face, the former gunfighter's own, eyes filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. "He's beautiful," Eli whispered. "What will you call him?" Nora had been thinking about names throughout her pregnancy, considering various options that would honor Thomas's memory while giving her son his own identity. But looking at this child who'd been born in the midst of violence, yet seemed to radiate peace, one name seemed perfectly appropriate. "Samuel," she said. "After my father, Samuel Thomas Talbot." "Samuel," Eli repeated, testing the name. "It suits him. Strong but gentle." Dr. Henderson completed his examination of Eli, finding only minor cuts and bruises despite the intensity of the gunfight. "You're remarkably intact for someone who just fought 4 armed men," the physician observed. "That wheelchair of yours is quite something." "It's more than I ever imagined possible," Eli replied, his eyes never leaving Nora and the baby. "Mrs. Talbot, Nora, what you created changed everything. Not just for me, but for this whole community." Martha bustled around the clinic, straightening supplies and preparing tea with the efficient movements of someone who coped with strong emotions through purposeful activity. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Jake dead and his gang scattered, what's next for all of us?" It was a fair question. The immediate threat had passed, but the events of the day had changed relationships and possibilities in ways that would take time to fully understand. Eli was no longer a broken man living in isolation. He was someone who'd proven his worth under the most extreme circumstances. Nora was no longer a pregnant widow facing an uncertain future alone. She was a mother, with a newborn son and a man who'd made his devotion unmistakably clear. "I'd like to court you properly," Eli said suddenly, his words directed at Nora, but spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. "With your permission, I'd like to court you with the intention of marriage, if you'll have me, both of you." A proposal for. That's what it was, despite the careful phrasing hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and full of promise. Nora looked at this man who'd risked his life to protect her community, who'd carved toys for a baby he'd never met, who'd shown her that love could arrive in the most unexpected forms and at the most unlikely times. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I think that would be very nice indeed." Baby Samuel chose that moment to make his first real cry, not the weak mewling of a newborn, but a strong, healthy wail that announced his presence to the world with unmistakable authority. Eli laughed at the sound, a rich, warm laugh that seemed to banish the last shadows of his violent past. Outside, the people of Cedar Ridge were beginning the somber task of cleaning up after violence, but inside the clinic, 3 people who'd found each other in the most extraordinary circumstances were beginning to plan for a future that suddenly seemed full of hope and endless possibility. The wooden horse sat on the table beside Nora's bed, but soon there would be a cradle, and perhaps someday a house where a former outlaw, a widowed blacksmith, and a child born during gunfire could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their individual pasts. The baby's cry gradually subsided into contented murmurs, as if he already understood that he'd been born into a world where love could triumph over fear, where courage could overcome any obstacle, and where even the most damaged souls could find redemption through sacrifice and hope. Asterisk. 6 months after the gunfight that transformed Cedar Ridge from a quiet settlement into a place where legends were made, Nora Granger sat on the porch of her new home, watching her husband teach their son to appreciate the simple pleasure of moving wheels through dust. The house itself was a testament to what two skilled craftspeople could accomplish when they combined their talents with shared purpose. Eli had designed and built the structure with accessibility in mind, creating wide doorways, gentle ramps, and carefully planned spaces that accommodated his wheelchair, while feeling natural and welcoming to anyone who entered. Nora had contributed. The ironwork custom hinges, window latches, and decorative elements that transformed functional construction into something approaching art. Little Samuel, now 6 months old and thriving beyond all expectations, sat securely in a miniature wheeled contraption that Eli had crafted during the long winter evenings. It wasn't quite a wheelchair, more like a padded cart with 4 carefully balanced wheels that allowed the baby to move under his own power while remaining safely contained. Samuel had taken to the device with the enthusiasm of someone born to appreciate good engineering, pushing himself around the house's wooden floors with delighted laughter. "He's going to be walking before we know it," Nora observed, sipping coffee from one of the ceramic cups Martha had given them as a wedding present. "Dr. Henderson says he's developing faster than most babies his age." Eli maneuvered his wheelchair closer to her chair, reaching out to take her free hand in his scarred but gentle grip. "He's got your determination and your father's mechanical aptitude. Poor kid doesn't stand a chance of being ordinary." The observation was delivered with the warm humor that had become characteristic of their household. A place where laughter came easily, and the past was acknowledged but not allowed to overshadow the present. Eli had changed profoundly since their marriage 3 months ago, the bitter edge of his personality worn smooth by daily exposure to love, purpose, and the simple satisfaction of building something worthwhile. Their wedding had been the social event of Cedar Ridge's brief history, with Father Miguel officiating, and half the territory's population attending the ceremony and celebration that followed. Martha had insisted on organizing the reception, transforming the mission's courtyard into a wonderland of white ribbons, wildflowers, and the kind of frontier feast that people would remember for decades. The bride had been radiant despite carrying a 3-month-old infant during the ceremony, while the groom had surprised everyone by arriving in a specially decorated wheelchair that featured carved wooden panels and brass fittings that caught the afternoon sunlight like jewelry. Tom Jenkins had served as best man, while Martha had stood as matron of honor, both of them beaming with the satisfaction of people who'd helped orchestrate a happy ending. But the real celebration had been quieter and more personal. The gradual transformation of 3 separate lives into something resembling a family. Eli had proven to be a devoted stepfather, spending hours with Samuel in ways that suggested genuine affection rather than dutiful obligation. He sang to the baby in a surprisingly sweet baritone, told stories about horses and heroes that held the infant's attention with remarkable effectiveness, and demonstrated a patience with crying and sleepless nights that amazed Nora with its depth. "I got word from Denver yesterday," Eli said, his tone growing more serious. "The territorial marshal wants to interview me about Jake's gang, settle some outstanding warrants, close some old cases. When do you need to go?" "Next month, probably. 3 or 4 days at most." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's just paperwork, mostly. Testimony about crimes I witnessed, that sort of thing. Nothing that puts us at risk." The prospect of his absence, even briefly, made Nora aware of how completely her sense of security had become tied to his presence. Not because she couldn't manage alone her competence with forge work and business. Matters had, if anything, increased since their marriage, but because she'd grown accustomed to having a partner who shared both responsibilities and rewards. "Will you take the chair to Denver?" she asked, gesturing toward his wheelchair. "Of course. Why?" "Because I've been thinking about your design modifications, and I have some ideas for improvements. If you're going to be traveling, we should make Sure you're as comfortable and capable as possible. Eli's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm that always appeared when they discussed engineering challenges. What kind of improvements? Better suspension for rough roads, maybe some kind of weather protection for winter travel. And I've been sketching ideas for storage compartments that wouldn't affect the balance or mobility. Their collaboration on mechanical projects had become one of the unexpected pleasures of their marriage. Eli's experience as a user combined with Nora's engineering skills had produced innovations that were attracting attention throughout the territory. Dr. Henderson had put them in contact with physicians in Denver and Santa Fe who were interested in commissioning similar devices for their patients. And word was spreading about the remarkable wheelchair, built by a frontier blacksmith and her gunfighter husband. Samuel made a happy gurgling sound as his wheeled contraption bumped gently against the porch railing, the impact cushioned by the leather padding Eli had installed for exactly that purpose. The baby's delight in mobility seemed to vindicate every hour they'd spent perfecting the design, every modification they'd made based on careful observation of his preferences and needs. He's going to expect his own horse by the time he's 5, Nora predicted, watching Samuel manipulate the simple steering mechanism with remarkable coordination for such a young child. I'm already planning the saddle, Eli admitted with a grin. Custom tooled leather, perfectly balanced stirrups, maybe some silver Concos if we can afford them. A casual reference to long-term planning reflected how completely Eli had embraced his role as Samuel's father. There had been no formal adoption frontier communities, rarely concerned themselves with such legal niceties, but everyone in Cedar Ridge understood that Eli Granger was raising Samuel Talbot as his own son, with all the love and responsibility. That relationship entailed Doc Martha appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden she'd helped Nora establish behind the workshop. At 54, Martha had taken on the unofficial role of grandmother to Samuel and advisor to his parents, a position she filled with characteristic efficiency and warmth. That child is going to be spoiled beyond redemption, she announced, watching Samuel navigate his mobile cart with obvious pleasure. Between his mother's intelligence, his father's attention, and everyone in town treating him like visiting royalty, he'll be impossible to manage by the time he's walking. Probably, Nora agreed cheerfully, but he'll also be loved, protected, and raised by people who understand the difference between right and wrong. Speaking of which, Martha continued, settling her basket on the porch steps, I had a visitor at the store today. Young woman from back east, traveling with her husband and their disabled boy. They'd heard about Eli's wheelchair and wanted to know if you might consider building something similar for their son. The request wasn't unusual. Word of Eli's remarkable mobility device had spread throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, carried by travelers, merchants, and the occasional newspaper correspondent who passed through Cedar Ridge. Most inquiries came to nothing. The cost and complexity of custom wheelchairs put them beyond the reach of most frontier families, but this one sounded different. What's the boy's situation? Eli asked. Born with some kind of spine problem, according to his mother. Never been able to walk, but he's bright as a new penny and desperate to get around on his own. They've got money husbands, some kind of engineer, working on railroad construction, and they're willing to wait however long it takes. Nora felt the familiar stirring of professional challenge combined with human compassion. Each wheelchair she and Eli designed was unique, tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of its user. The work was demanding, expensive, and time-consuming, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that went beyond mere craftsmanship. We could meet with them, she said. See what's needed, whether it's something we can handle. I'd like that, Eli replied, and not just for the money. Every child deserves the chance to move through the world on their own terms. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across their property and painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nora reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a pregnant widow facing an uncertain future alone. Now she was part of a family that had emerged from tragedy, violence, and loss to create something beautiful and enduring. Samuel had fallen asleep in his mobile cart, his small body relaxed and peaceful in the way that only completely secure children could manage. Eli reached down to lift the baby gently, settling him against his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent months learning the rhythms and requirements of infant care. "I love you," Nora said quietly, the words carrying a weight of gratitude and wonder that never seemed to diminish despite daily repetition. "I love you too," Eli replied, his free arm encircling her shoulders as they sat together watching the sun disappear behind the peaks that sheltered their valley. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." The baby cradle that Eli had built during those tense weeks before the gunfight sat empty now in Samuel's nursery, replaced by a proper crib as their son grew and developed. But the cradle remained as a symbol of hope fulfilled, of promises kept, and of the way love could transform even the most damaged souls into something approaching whole. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and new opportunities to serve their community and build their life together. But tonight, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky and the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the valley below, three people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat together in perfect contentment, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of love given freely and received gratefully. In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, carrying travelers toward unknown destinations and reminding them that the world was large and full of possibilities. But here on their porch, with their son sleeping peacefully and their future stretching ahead like an uncharted frontier, Eli and Nora Granger had everything they needed: each other, their child, and the unshakable conviction that some stories, despite beginning in loss and hardship, were always meant to end in hope.